Hi, welcome to my new channel, Lauscho Plays, and this is going to be where I post my gaming-related stuff from now on. And I thought I would start us off by reviewing a game that I've been very hotly anticipating all fall, all summer. That's Grid 2019. It was released October 11th by Codemasters. They've done some absolutely wonderful racing games in the past, and I thought it would be really fun to take a look at this game. So, first off, what is Grid? Well, the Grid series started in 2008, replacing Codemasters' Touring Car Championship racing games. Those games had licenses from various real-world racing championships like DTM or German Touring Car Masters, and Australia's V8 Supercars series. Now, even though Grid replaced this, it still kind of carries the same sort of tone with various different racing disciplines all explored in the same game. It's kind of a cornucopia of different racing styles. Now, they released Grid 2 in 2013, and in 2014 released Grid Autosport, which was sort of a bit of a return to the simulation kind of aspect of the touring car franchise, a little bit more focus on the touring cars themselves. Now, is this a sim or an arcade racer? If you have a sliding scale from Mario Kart to Assetto Corsa, this is probably closer to Assetto Corsa than it is to Mario Kart, but it's still very firmly in the arcade side of things. It's not quite as realistic in terms of its physics or handling as, say, a Gran Turismo, Forza, or, again, Assetto Corsa title. So this game is probably going to appeal more to people who are looking for something along the lines of PS4's Drive Club, which was recently taken off of the PlayStation Store. Not necessarily the most realistic driving game, but definitely a lot more than a Need for Speed or, again, another kart racing title. This is definitely going to appeal to someone who wants a really good racing game that's easy to pick up, doesn't tax the brain too much, but still feels more realistic than one of those tuner car games or a kart racer. Alright, so now we have to talk about content. Now, the game does have a couple of limitations, particularly in its track list. There's only 13 different tracks. Each track does have its own unique layout, and several of them, but the list of tracks is rather limited from the get-go, and the car list is pretty decent. There's a little bit of everything from touring cars to really high-power classic racing cars to open-wheel racers, and even some JDM touring car type race cars. You'll notice that every car in this game is a racing tuned car, and that seems to definitely be on purpose. I think Grid is trying to go for more of a racing kind of feel rather than, just a car collection or, the focus being on physics of games like Forza or Gran Turismo. This is definitely more of a love letter to motorsport. There is an extensive career mode that features 5 different disciplines, from touring car to stock cars to JDM tuners, Grand Touring, and the Fernando Alonso, which is mostly the high-powered racing cars, Formula One cars, anything like that. And you get to complete all of the different events in these, and at the very end of each event you get a showdown. You have to complete 4 of these showdowns to play the Grid World Series. There's also a selection of invitational races that are just kind of on the side, and those are pretty fun. The game also features a free play mode, which lets you just pick a track, pick a car, and have a single race, and just have a bit of fun. You can basically rent a car for the game if it's one that's not already in your garage, and it'll take a certain cut of your winnings rather than make you pay for a car that you maybe don't want at that point. And you get to change different aspects of it, like you can change the name of the tournament, you can change how many rounds you want, how you want your grid position to look, all kinds of things like that. There's also an online multiplayer, and it's pretty basic. You really only get randomly put into a race. You don't really get to pick a car beforehand or a track. You just basically get dropped into a lobby and kind of left to fend for yourself for that. It's not the best online multiplayer system I've seen, but it certainly isn't the worst. One of the really sort of cool attentions to detail about is that you get a bit of a waiting room, which is the Demolition Derby track from prior Grid games, and you just basically get to drive around in it. You can drive around with the other players and, even practice a little bit if you've got the time to do so, although I never really find that there's a lot of time to do that. Alright, so let's talk about the gameplay. So, like I mentioned, the handling physics are definitely more on the arcade side of things, but you can tweak so many aspects of it. If you change the difficulty level, you can actually get this game feeling pretty simulation-y. The racing itself is fairly fun, but there are a couple of things that do play into it a little, like the Nemesis system. Basically, when you bump into other drivers a lot, you may end up pissing them off, and they'll start to basically do anything in their power to knock you off the track or get in front of you. And I found that this is one of those ideas that really worked out better on paper than in practice. I find that one of the big issues when I'm trying to complete a race is I'll almost literally play bumper cars with every other car on the track in front of me and not come up with any nemesis. But if I so much as touch my teammate, and the teammate system in this game is decent, not all that different from any other Grid game, but if I so much as bump into my teammate, I make a nemesis out of them, and that does actually affect the race a bit, as your nemesis, if it's your teammate, will basically just not respond to any commands to push ahead or fall back. The other problem that I had with the nemesis system is that even though it's supposed to make it so that your nemesis does everything in their power to get you off the track, I find that they're usually pretty easy to deal with on the game's default difficulty settings. They don't really cause you any more of an issue than any other driver on the track. I found myself being pit maneuvered or bumped into just as often by drivers that didn't have a nemesis tag above them as I do the ones that I made nemesis out of. There's not a whole lot in the way of penalties when you're on track. Basically, if you go off track too much and cut a corner, you'll get a couple seconds added to your time, but I've never noticed any penalties beyond that. Although, it's easy to fix these penalties by doing a rewind. The rewind function is pretty much the same as every other Grid game. You get a certain number of them on default settings, 5 of them, and you can rewind to a certain point if you crashed or if you went off the track and got a penalty. You could rewind quite a bit of a ways, something like, I think it's like 10 seconds behind or something, and just retake that section again. So let's talk now about graphics and performance. Now, the game actually does run pretty well. I'm not much of a frame per second snob, so I couldn't really tell you if it's 30 or 60, but I can tell you that the output that I'm capturing with my game card is 30 frames per second. So if it's 60, don't take this as how the game is actually going to look on your PS4. The graphical fidelity itself is not bad. It isn't the best looking PS4 racing game I've seen, but it certainly is a good looking game. There's no real issues. Every once in a while there might be the occasional terrible lighting issue far off in the background that pops up, but you don't really notice it unless you're looking for it. I also haven't noticed a fair amount of bugs or issues with the game. Everything in the game so far seems to run pretty smoothly. The only time I've ever seen anything a little suspect is when you're in the online races. Every once in a while you'll have cars kind of pop in and out, but that's pretty standard fare for just about any racing game that has an online component. You won't find much difference between that and other games like Gran Turismo or Forza or anything like that. So I would definitely say that performance-wise, this game is pretty solid. No real issues. It's all pretty standard. So my final verdict on the game, it's good. It has a lot of things that I really like from the older Grid titles, and it does feel a little bit more like a cross between the original Grid games and Grid Autosport, in that even though it's not a simulation racer and it has very arcadey handling, the focus does seem to be a lot more on the racing car experience itself, the overall racing experience. And I found that to be very much the gist of Grid Autosport. It was more about the racing than collecting cars or doing, certain types of tournaments here and there. And the fact that it kind of has a focus again on, touring car and, grand tours, kind of almost makes it seem like it's harking back a little bit to the touring car franchise. And, it's kind of a good game in the sense that if you really liked the Toka franchise back in the day for the PS2, you might actually find some things to like about this. It isn't as deep as Grid Autosport, but it is a solid title. I think the only real issue I have with it is the title of it itself. It's just simply called Grid, and I'm often quite down on reboots to begin with, but when you consider that the original game only came out 11 years ago, and its sequel came out this decade, it seems a little weird that they would just simply call this Grid. Why not Grid 3 or Grid 4 if you consider Grid Autosport Grid 3? This isn't really a reboot, more of a good continuation of the franchise. Other than that, I can't think of any real issues with the game. Maybe the limited track selection, but they are addressing that with some downloadable content, which reportedly will be free. And I purchased the Ultimate Edition, which is supposed to contain some cars and access to different seasons, and none of the season content has been released yet, so I can't really comment on any of that as of yet. So, if I have to grade this game out of 10, I'd say it's an 8 out of 10. There's a few things I'd like to see added, some more tracks, maybe a few different types of cars, and some more events, but overall, this is a really solid title, and I'm glad I picked it up. Anyway, thank you for watching. Take care.